Hi, good morning.
Hi.
Can you hear me okay today? Let's just check
Yes,
out. Yeah, we're good?
we're great.
Good, awesome. All right, welcome everyone to the last day of our Practice with Clara morning gathering. This week our theme was ether, but on Fridays we do a AMA with Clara. So it's open forum, ask Clara anything. If you want to add your question, you can write to us and we'll keep a little eye on the comments to see what arises as we chat. Um, We're going to start with something that was posted in the Facebook group to open on book recommendations. So, Clara, what are some of your favorite philosophy, spirituality, or poetry books that you would recommend to our viewers?
I have a lot of books. So what I'm going to do is I brought them all. They're all beside me. I'm going to go through them and give the why. And then I'll also post on the Facebook group all of the books. So don't worry about it in terms of the titles. Just receive the information. And if anything sticks, then you can check on the Facebook page. One thing that I will say is that Steph and I are super big book lovers. It's actually one of the things that really brings us together. And I will also say that I'm going to ask Steph after I share my book recommendations for her to share hers, because one thing I will say is I read a lot of yoga books and I love fiction. And for the last couple years, I'd only been reading yoga books. And so I had turned to Steph maybe about a year ago and asked her for book recommendations. And she would give me about 6 books at a time, literally physical books. I would read them and then give them back to her, and she would give me 6 more. So I'm really excited for her to share her recommendations because she has great taste. Okay, so that being said, here we go. So this was the book that I talked about yesterday and posted on the Facebook group, which is Prakriti by Dr. Robert Svoboda. He is a philosophy a writer as well as an Ayurvedic writer, and I feel like Prakriti is one of the best books on Ayurveda. It's the most accessible, and I feel like it really allows for real tools versus it just being theoretical. So that would be that. Another book on tools that I really love is Rod Stryker's The Four Desires. And essentially he goes through, it's a lot of journaling. So if you're looking to kind of work on or figure out what your life purpose is, this book is the book for you. I highly recommend it. It's super accessible, yoga related, and lots of writing. So if you're a writer and that's your way of processing, that would be the book that I would recommend. Next book I'd recommend is the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. And this translation is by Mukti Bodhi Nanda, and it's part of the Bihar School of Yoga. And so we generally talk a lot about the Yoga Sutras by Patanjali, but I will say that as a Hatha Yoga practitioner, meaning a physical practitioner of yoga, this is the Bible. Okay, this was the first book that was written in terms of the lineage of the physical aspect of yoga, and it is ginormous. And essentially, it's all the original practices in Hatha Yoga before Krishnamacharya kind of added his bent to it. The first part, the introduction, is a history of yoga, and I feel like it's one of the best comprehensive histories of yoga. So I'd highly recommend this book, especially if you are a physical practitioner. Moving into philosophy, I'm just going to move these around a little bit. So we talked a lot about Tantra last week when we were talking about the Radiant Sutras by Lauren Roche, or his translation of them. So there are a lot of books on Tantra, and I find a lot of them are actually quite dry. So the book that I always recommend for people to start with in terms of Tantra is Tantric Quest by Daniel Odier. Daniel Odier is one of my teacher, Shiva Ray's teachers. He's still alive. I've studied with him maybe about 4 or 5 times. I love him. If you have the chance, he lives in France. He usually comes to, Shiva usually brings him once a year to America, but if you happen to be in Europe, which I don't know if we're going to be anytime soon, but if you happen to live there or whatever, he is an amazing teacher. So Tantric Quest is essentially it's an autobiography of his experience of meeting a tantrika, which was his teacher in India. And I find it super accessible in the fact that it teaches you about philosophy through his experience with his teacher, which to me, I feel like is a lot easier to kind of swallow versus it being super theoretical. So I'd read a ton of books on Tantra beforehand and felt like wasn't really getting a sense. And then when I read this, I was like, okay, now I understand. And then going back and reading the other books, I was like, okay, this is it. So Tantric Quest by Daniel Odier. And then the other book, I've read everything that he's written, but the other book by him that I'd recommend is the Yoga Spandakarika. And the Spandakarika is essentially is a sacred text of Tantra. It's his translation. But what I love about this specific translation is that he brings in commentary and mirrors a Buddhist take on Tantra. So the Hindu take and the Buddhist take in one book. And I feel like he marries them together, which a lot of people in classic tantric philosophy have a hard time with, but I think it's so good because it gives you kind of a mirroring or a compare and contrast, which I really like. So Spandakarika, Tantric Quest. Okay. Then moving in towards Buddhism, because Buddhism is another one that we tend to talk a lot about in the yoga community. So the book that I would say is the one that I get everybody to read, and this is my dad's favorite book. My dad's really big on Buddhism, is The Myth of Freedom by Chogyam Trungpa. And he seems like we like a lot of rebels, my father and I. He was quite the rebel in the Buddhist community. He is the one who opened up the Naropa Center in Colorado, which was the first university that was specifically on Eastern thought in North America. And it's still there in Boulder, Colorado. So The Myth of Freedom, great, great book. It's a little bit, not even a little bit, it's intense. He's intense. He died of alcoholism, and there's like the story of Chogyam Trungpa is quite scandalous. However, that being said, I feel like this book is like really gets into the nitty gritty of Buddhism and kind of what arises in meditation and how to work with it, which I really love, especially the shadow side, which fascinates me a lot because I think that we need to talk about the shadow, our shadows a lot more. Moving from there, something that's a little bit softer is A Path with Heart. So still staying in the Buddhist tradition. And this is Jack Kornfield. He's still alive, lives in California. And A Path with Heart is a wonderful book on, again, how to deal with emotions as they arise in meditation, because I feel like that's something that inevitably happens, especially when sitting for long periods of time. And so it's a beautiful book on how to work with the emotions as they come up from he's a therapist. So from a therapist from a Western bent on Eastern philosophy. Love this book. Okay. And then the last one going into a little bit of a different style is for Tibetan Buddhism is the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And either Robert Thurman's translation or Rinpoche, I'll have to get back to you. I lent my other translation to someone and it's gone. So, but I'll put it in. But either of these two, the Tibetan Book of the Dead is a wonderful book. And what I love specifically about Tibetan Buddhism is that they are fascinated by death in that their whole entire practice is to prepare for death, which is the greatest liberation. And again, as one thing that I find so fascinating about that is that we in the West generally kind of shy away from death when they really embrace it. And so moving towards and working towards that which is not permanent, because nothing is permanent, we really learn how to live by working with death. So this is like really, really yummy, 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 yummy. Okay, going back to Indian philosophy. So I just talked about Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. I'm not even going to bring them up because I feel like everybody always talks about them. So I'm sure you've already got lots of books on that. So I'm going to go into the other sacred text of yoga that we talk a lot about, which is the Bhagavad Gita. Probably my favorite story in the whole entire world. I've read it and taught it for over a decade, and I'm like, I can't get enough. So Bhagavad Gita is a story between Arjuna, which is us, and Krishna, which is God or his greater self. And essentially the whole entire book is a conversation between the two of them when essentially he's standing on the battlefield about to make the hardest decision of his life. And what I love about the story is that we've all stood on that battlefield. We have stood on it many, many times when we've had to make a decision that we didn't want to make, but we knew we needed to. And essentially, this is, what do we do when shit hits the fan? Which would be a good time. Actually, I would be reading this one. Maybe we should all be reading this one now. Yeah. So so this translation of it is Stephen Mitchell. I highly recommend this one as the first variation of it that you read, because I feel like it's the most digestible, and essentially it is a poem and he writes it like a poem. So I'd recommend that. And then if you want to start geeking out, I have about 7 translations, but another translation that I love is called the Living Gita by Swami Satyananda. And I feel like this is a beautiful commentary. So the Stephen Mitchell, there's no commentary, it's just the translation. And then this one has commentary, and I love Satyananda's take on it. So I highly recommend that. And then last but not least on this one, I don't know why I'll just show you a white book. This is Paths of God, and this is Ram Dass's lecture on the Bhagavad Gita at the Naropa Center. So essentially, this whole entire book is a transcription of his teachings of the Bhagavad Gita. And so if you've ever heard Ram Dass speak, Ram Dass is one of my dad's heroes. So living in my house, growing up with my dad, Ram Dass was like on the cassette tape a lot in my life. So I feel like he's an uncle of mine, and who just recently left his body and left a beautiful body of work. And so Paths of God is a wonderful, essentially, course on the Bhagavad Gita and how you can relate it to your life. Okay, last book, because I could really go on for about 5 hours on books. So last one is my good old teacher, Shiva Ray. She wrote a book a couple of years ago called Tending the Heart Fire. And this is a beautiful book on ceremony. And one of the greatest gifts that I feel like Shiva has is this idea of transmission and embodiment through either being with her, or in this book specifically, through images. And so one thing that I recommend this book, it has a little bit of everything, but a lot of what she's talking about in this book specifically is about ritual. And how do we create ritual in the everyday? How do we do it with the seasons? How do we do it with the moon? And so this book, whenever I'm seeking inspiration, I literally just open it up. There's a lot of different mudras and moving meditations. And it's just a wonderful book for inspiration. That was a lot of information. And again, I promise I'll write it all out. And I just wanted you to kind of receive, but this is just the starting, let's say. And so, this is what I spent the last 8 years of my life reading about. I love reading. And so, yes, there it is. And then I hand it over to you, my friend Steph, in terms of any books that you would bring to our community. What would you recommend?
So I'll give 3 books that are along the lines of philosophy and spirituality. Thomas More's Dark Nights of the Soul.
Oh, great one.
Which is about how to live through our sadnesses and not necessarily labeling things in terms of a depressive state, but inviting the full spectrum of what it means to be human in the highs and the lows, the joys and the sorrows.
Yes.
So good. And so Thomas More has a lot of other books that are great if you want to look him up. Joseph Campbell, who your dad recommended.
Father Joe.
So good. The Hero's Journey is the one that most stands out. I forget what the other books are that he's written, but it's an epic of kind of all the trials and tribulations that man would go through in his life. And one of the moments I remember is the discourse around how all of us have to go through a point of tension to become embodied, that there is points of conflict that we're all meant to go through to grow into our fullness of the self, I guess you would say.
Yes.
Carolyn Meese, Anatomy of the Soul. Everything by Carolyn Meese is great. She has a couple of books. Anatomy of the Soul is the one I would recommend. And I'm going to recommend some fiction just because I love seeing what we discuss in philosophy and spirituality in play through characters. I find it a little bit more easier to relate when I see characters going through the same events that I've experienced rather than just reading the theory. One book that I recently finished, One Great Year. It's by a couple from North Van, Renee DeFabio and Tamara Viich. I might be butchering their names, but it's the idea of energy and these three types of energy that are born in the cosmos, and they keep being reincarnated through different bodies, like Aristotle, Plato, an Egyptian princess, and you see how these different energies, kind of like the gunas, what we discussed yesterday, are at play in the world, and how different events and relationships manifest from the interplay of the energies. Gregory David Roberts' book Shantaram, which is based in Bombay, India. It's the story of it's fiction, but it's based on real events that happened to him. He's a criminal that escapes jail in Australia and ends up in India. And I'm reading his second book that isn't as good, but I'm not done yet, so I'm not gonna really speak to that. And then two female writers who have collections of short stories that I feel really show the human condition are Clarice Lispector and Miranda July. So two great female authors that just have really short narratives that show just the dualistic experience we're all living in really funny and heart-wrenching ways. So if you're into fiction, check them out.
And so we'll both, so Steph and I will both post our book recommendations on the Facebook page. So feel free again to check it out there, because lots of information coming through. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
And for continuing to share fiction with me, which I love.
So let's maybe go into some of the other questions. We have time. Clara, kind of riffing off of what we talked about yesterday with Ayurveda, the doshas, and creating harmony and balance, I was hoping you could speak to, one more time, the three different energies, Vata, Pitta, and Kapha, in what the constitution looks like, how different activities and foods could balance out that dosha. And then maybe later when you have time, since you have said you've been cooking so much, maybe you can post recipes you've used that would be Kaphic or balance out Vata or whatever have you.
Great. Yes. So we talked about this in terms of finding balance yesterday, but we kind of cut in and out. So we thought we would recap, or I would recap kind of what happened yesterday. So Ayurveda, the sister science of yoga. So essentially yoga is the way of maintaining, the philosophy of maintaining our mind and our spirit. And Ayurveda is the way of maintaining our bodies and the everyday life. And so the two of them together would be harmonizing body, mind, and spirit. And so in Ayurveda, the rule of thumb is always like attracts like and opposite heals. Like attracts like and opposite heals. And that's just something to always remember, so that depending upon whether or not you're feeling balanced, if you're feeling balanced, then you continue doing what you're doing because you're doing a good job. And then if you check in and you're feeling imbalanced, then what you would do is you would do the opposite. You would seek the opposite to find harmony or balance. So we were talking specifically in this kind of moment of time. We always recommend, or Ayurveda always recommends, that when you wake up in the morning, right, to kind of check in with how you're feeling. And so not being attached to quote unquote what your dosha is or what your constitution is, but instead thinking about, how am I feeling this morning? And then based on that, I'm going to do a specific kind of practice, and I'm going to eat a specific kind of food in order to find that balance. So those of us who are waking up in the morning, we're feeling anxious, we didn't sleep very much, the mind is racing. That means that your Vata is imbalanced, meaning you have too much air. Okay. So when we have too much air, when we're really, again, we're up here in the mind, right? That is the sign of Vata. There's a lot of movement in the mind itself, and again, anxiety, things like that. Then what we want to do is we want to do a practice that is very grounding. So if you're able to in the morning, if you're fortunate enough to have that time, then you would wake up and you would start your practice ideally with Nadi Shodhana, alternate nostril breathing, right? To kind of bring down the energy. And you would do a practice that is very slow moving and very low to the ground, with an emphasis on your legs and hip openers. So again, having the energy come back down, having your awareness come back down, and through the physical body, actually connecting with your legs and your pelvis. So those would be the things that you would do in terms of your practice. And then ideally with meditation, you would do slow, deep breathing. And again, a meditation that keeps you very low to the ground. So for me, when I'm feeling that way, I focus on my sit bones and breathing into my sit bones, the bottom part of my pelvis, and just envisioning literally grounding like a tree. I'm rooting. This is the way I think of my sit bones. I imagine that roots are coming out of my sit bones and going down into the earth and holding onto the earth. Food. So like attracts like, opposite heals. Generally, when we are up in the air, we're seeking things that are dry. So dried nuts, food that is raw, things like that. We don't want that. So you want the opposite. You want slow cooked, ideally, food. You want food that has a bit more of a heavier nature. So potatoes, yams, like literal root vegetables, things that grow in the ground would be really good for your breakfast. Ideally, no stimulants, so no caffeine, nothing, no sugar, and nothing that kind of, again, creates more stimulation. You want less stimulation. So slow cooked food, right? Warm food, and things that have this heavier nature. Things that are very oily is a really big recommendation. So this would be, I'm recommending all kaphic food, all earthbound food. So oily foods, food that has high fat, like avocados, things like that. And so you would eat those kinds of foods, again, to like, bring you down. Yeah. You're waking up, you're feeling super aggressive, you're feeling angry, you're having like these kind of very strong, intense, fiery emotions. So that would be that your pitta is imbalanced. You have a lot of fire there. You've woken up with night sweats is a great example of too much pitta. You have a rash like eczema or hives or anything like that. That means that there's too much fire. Literally, it's coming out in terms of that. And so what we need is cooling. So similar to what we offered in terms of when we have too much vata, when we have too much pitta, too much fire, your yoga practice would be, again, kind of slower moving. Your pranayams would be nadi shodhana, 4-part breathing, things that have a very cooling effect. I highly recommend breathing out of the mouth as you exhale. That creates literal cooling in the body. Okay, slow flow practice, yin practice. Generally, pitta people don't love the yin, but this would be the time to do yin, restorative, or a slow moving vinyasa practice. All of those would be really, really good for balancing pitta. And then in terms of foods, similar to vata, you don't want a lot of stimulants, so no caffeine. Biggest thing would be hot sauce or spice. You want to eat foods that are very I don't want to say dull, but dull is the word that we generally describe it. You want to eat things that don't have a lot of flavor. So maybe just a little bit of salt, a little bit of pepper in terms of seasoning, but not very much. You want things ideally that are boiled or, again, cooked. And cucumber, yogurt are big ones for creating a cooling effect. And so, yeah, so those would be the things for pitta. Now, if you wake up and you're feeling super lethargic, can't get out of bed, feel like the world is heavy on your shoulders, especially again now in this time period, that can be definitely, I feel like I'm speaking to a lot of friends, and that's what's been showing up. And so when we're feeling that way, then we need to go the opposite. So this would be pranayama practices would be like Kapalabhati, skull shining breath, Bhastrika breath, anything that creates a lot of heat. You want heat, you want stimulants, you want to get up, okay? Because that's going to help to motivate and lift you out of the heaviness, the dullness of kapha. And so vinyasa practice that is much higher up, a lot more standing poses, things I would highly recommend, like moving meditation with your arms, some sort of, I would have music that has a lot of drums and kind of gets you like wanting to dance. Those are the things that I would recommend. And in terms of a meditation practice, you could do what we did on Tuesday together, Indra's web, right? So imagining that you're going up and out, feeling this web in terms of the interconnectedness, really reaching out to friends and doing things that are community based are really helpful when we're feeling heavy. So have a FaceTime date with your friends, do things like that, reach out. You need to go out in terms of your energy. And so with that, your diet would look like, this is when stimulants would come in. You would have caffeine, or you would have spice in your food. You would have, today's not a good day for it, but generally if it was warmer out, you would have raw food. You'd have food that has a lot of water in it, but also that kind of raises you up. Ideally, you avoids fats, you would avoid oily food, you avoid very simple carbohydrates, because all of those things create a heaviness. Yeah. So those would be ways that you can balance yourself in your day-to-day.
And something that on your website, the Practice with Clara site, Clara has a Elements series where there's specific classes for earth, fire, air, water, and we're releasing the ether flow today. So if you're interested in kind of seeing how each of the elements works in a movement or meditation practice, you can find it on Clara's website. So
and then while you're looking at that, just remember, like attracts like and opposite heals. Yeah. So if I'm doing good where I am, then seek out the element that you're kind of feeling in your body. And then if you're not feeling balanced, then seek the opposite. Yeah. And so we have, again, practices for each of those, along with different kinds of meditations. So definitely check those out, and mantras for sure.
And when you say, Clara, the boa breath you did on Tuesday, that would be good for any of the balancing, just because it was standing, it was moving, and we'll share the video for this once we have it so you can see how to do boa's breath. I'm interested. What is it that from, Clara?
So it's from a martial art I used to study called Chin Lung. And essentially it's a cross between Kung Fu, yoga, dance, and Tai Chi. My teacher, Constantine Darling, created the style. He's recently, or not recently, he left his body about 7 years ago, but there is the lineage holder is a man named Stephen Marcala, and he's based out of Santa Fe, New Mexico. And if you look up, and maybe I'll post this, if you look up Celestial Dragons, that's the website, and you'll see a lot of different forms from him. So this was the most ethereal form, which is boa.
And you could balance any of the doshas with that.
Yes, I would, just because it is slow moving. If you are feeling quite ethereal already, it might not be super great for you, depending upon whether or not you feel like you need to ground. But the slow movement kind of keeps you going anyway. So I would recommend it. Yeah.
Cool. Great. Do we want to do one more question?
Yeah, let's do one more.
One more question?
Yes.
So the last question is around how you feel having, we've been doing these chats for 2 weeks now. Last week the theme is beauty. This week it's ether. How do you feel bringing essentially what was a private kind of philosophical discussion between Clara and I once a week to the public realm? Like, how has your day-to-day shifted? What are these talks doing for you? What are you learning from them? What are you happy to bring to the community through the Practice with Clara morning gathering?
Such a good question.
Yeah.
I feel like it's been a godsend for me. I officially went on mat leave March 1st. I was still doing work, but not in the public sphere, mostly with training and smaller communities of people. And then we had to cancel that because we're social distancing with everybody now. And so I feel like this community is really, really important to me. It's part of my dharma, is to be part of community. And so when we came up with this idea, Alejandro, Steph, and I, at first I was like, we'll see how it goes. And I have to say that, like, it's been the highlight of my day. Just prepping for this and thinking about what I want to talk about and share, and then also receiving the comments and having dialogue on the Facebook page, as well as connecting with you every day, Steph. I feel like it's been so healing for me. And it's a way that I feel like I'm literally having some social time with people that I love, talking about things that I love. So I personally have been so thankful for it. And we were kind of talking about it this week because I'm essentially due in 2 weeks. The baby is supposed to come. And so we were like, well, should we continue doing this? And I was like, I think I want to continue doing this until my water breaks, just because I feel like it's been such, such a gift to do this. So I'm really appreciative. And then you, Steph, how's it been for you?
Oh, I would second everything you've said and add to it just by saying like it's it's exciting. I love like checking what other people are saying and kind of peppering the dialogue with the questions and comments and planning for what we're going to offer next week. Like it's funny, I thought that the Bhagavad Gita would go with our theme next week. I won't say what it is, but then you today bringing up like, this is my favorite book. Yeah, like let's talk about it. And then the feedback we get from people both here and in Facebook and other spaces. So it's been nice to have a focus and know that this like feedback loop, this reassurance that we're all sitting with the same thing and there's support. You just have to figure out the spaces to go find it. And I'm excited to see what else we can come up with, what we can all create together.
Oh,
Yeah.
so I wanted to end, thank you for sharing that. I wanted to end Guapo or Alejandro. Alejandro, my husband, I call him Guapo, which means handsome because he's very handsome. But that's what I call him most of the time. So if you ever hear me say Guapo, that's who I mean is my man. We picked some cards this morning, some spiritual warrior or earth warrior cards. And one of them I felt like I wanted to share because I thought it was beautiful for all of us to hear. So if you can, I'd love you to close your eyes. If not, feel free to just sit and receive. But again, I find that with readings, it's really nice to close the eyes and allow just one sense to be cut off so that the other senses are heightened. And so I picked Durga this morning, and it's the wisdom Durga, which is the Agna Durga. And Durga, if we don't know each other, she is my homegirl. She's my favorite. And I thought this was beautiful, so I wanted to end with this today. So, the power of good is the name of this card. Believe in the power of the divine to keep an eye on things for you. Trust that power to alert you when you need to know something or to understand what is happening in your life and what you need, even if you're not sure of that yourself at times. Be active in contesting negativity. The moment you feel something isn't coming from love, acknowledge it. You don't have to make it about you or to analyze it, just acknowledge it. Use your divine connection to deal with it promptly and effectively. And then call for divine support in all things. You will not divert help away from someone else if you ask for it yourself. When you allow yourself to be helped, this empowers your path, which in turn helps all beings. Divine assistance is always there for you unconditionally. If you're not thinking the best thoughts, divine support will correct your thoughts. Never hesitate to call for that support. It is your greatest ally. Give up your attachment to past experiences of rejection and abandonment so that you can open up to how much the divine loves you and can help you. Practice feeling the confidence and unconditional trust in a higher power, knowing it is stronger than all else. And so what I loved about this, specifically right now, is this idea of support and asking for it. And so not only asking for it in your community, but also asking for it in your practice and knowing that it is here for us. Okay, so especially in a very trying time, which we are in right now, right? May I continue to seek support. May I also trust that there is support and love, and that as emotions come up, right, acknowledging them, and then making a choice of whether or not to put my energy there or to shift it, right? And so this is, I think, the greatest gift of this practice is we always have choice. I would say 90% of the time. There is definitely sometimes when we don't have choice, but most of the time we have choice of how we want to experience this moment. And so trust that you can choose. Yeah.
Cool.
So thank you so much, everybody. And I usually give you homework on Friday, so I've got just a little bit of homework. And so your homework for the weekend is to observe when you feel trust and observe when you don't. Okay? And with that, no judgment either way, but just observe it. In this moment, I trust. And kind of observe the situation that you're in when you're feeling that trust. And then observe the moments when you don't feel trust and observe what's happening in those moments. Because through the observation, through the perspective, you might begin to create a container or situations in our life where we create more trust. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome.
Have a beautiful weekend.
Thank you.
And we'll be back on Monday. Yeah. And Steph, as always, a pleasure sharing sacred space with you.
Thank you, Clara.
And yeah, we'll see you guys on Monday.
See you.
Thank you for joining us today on the podcast. Today's podcast is brought to you by the Practice with Clara app. That's mine. I've created almost 100 yoga classes for you to do at home or on the go. And they're available to you on your favorite device, including mobile, desktop, and TV. These classes include Vinyasa, Slow Flow, Hatha, Restorative, Yin, Mantra, Meditation. I also just had a baby, so I created prenatal yoga for all 4 trimesters. So head over to clararobertsoss.com/join to learn more. Or search for the Practice with Clara app at your favorite app store. There's a 7-day free trial, so no commitment. And make sure to subscribe to the podcast. We've got lots of good stuff in store for you. Until next time, namaste.